She was 10, a child. Yet in the blood-soaked dawn of 1886, she stood amid the bodies of 600 soldiers, each fallen by her hand, each breath ending as her secret shattered empires. But that is just the beginning. In the first flicker of candlelight, the story hides. I want you to imagine an unmarked graveyard in a nameless forest, greener than any you've seen, humming with dusk's final sigh. No official record speaks of her, no statue honors her name, only the scars sewn deep into history, stitched by those who refused to tell the truth. Listen, this secret breathes in the hush of grand libraries, in the margin notes of dusty tomes bound in cracked leather. It's a whisper that echoes beyond pages, into the minds of young men who dare to unlearn their world, because what they taught you about revolution, about courage, about the high price of freedom, it's only half the story. The real tale lies hidden in what they burned, what they buried, and what they locked away behind iron and fear. By now you may wonder, how could a child do such a thing? That is exactly the question they wanted you to ask. They commanded narratives, they censored evidence, they buried her. But I'm not just telling you history, I'm pulling you into it. Each revelation unravels the illusions they sold you, of honor, of nobility, of civilized warfare. And it starts here, with that single image, a silhouette under moonlight, delicate bones gripping a rifle the size of her small frame, smoke rising like specter serpents from the corpses at her feet. The world recoiled, entire armies shattered, empires trembled, yet no historian dared name her, no textbook dared explain how a child wielded the power to unmake nations. That silence is deliberate, because what they cover up is more than scandal, it's the architecture of control. They want you to believe your life is safe within their stories. But this changes everything. This secret is an invitation. You're not just watching, you're awakening. And I promise, as we descend deeper into this rabbit hole, nothing will feel the same again. The foundational myths that built your worldview, they were lies. And the key to unbinding yourself is buried here, in the echoes of the forest, in that child's defiant trigger finger. Stay close. We're just getting started. The sun had long since dipped below the copper ridges of the Sierra Madre when the whispers returned, the same whispers that had haunted Lozen's ears since childhood. Not words, not really, but something deeper. A vibration that passed through skin and bone, echoing in the hollow of her chest. The river knew her name. The desert wind sang her fate. She stood barefoot on the red earth, watching the water twist like a serpent through the ravine. Her eyes were obsidian, unreadable, ancient, too deep for any 12-year-old. She wasn't supposed to be here. She should have been tending the fire with the other girls. But Lozen had never obeyed rules written by men. Behind her, a figure stirred. Her older brother, Victorio, war chief of the Chiheni band of the Chiricahua Apache, watched silently. He'd tracked her here, just like before, but this time, he said nothing. Lozen didn't need to turn to feel his gaze. She spoke to the river instead. They're coming. Victorio didn't ask how she knew. He had long since stopped doubting. She had the power, the gift of sight, not the kind given by gods or devils, but the ancient pulse of the land itself. She could feel enemies before they crossed the horizon, feel their steel-tipped boots crushing sagebrush, smell their fear, their hunger, their confusion, as if she walked among them in spirit. How many? He asked. She paused. A hawk cried overhead. Too many. Victorio exhaled slowly. Not fear, acceptance. There were always too many, but Lozen's eyes did not flinch. She was only a girl in form, but already the elders whispered that the spirit of war had made her womb its tomb. She would not bear children. She would bear death. Her brother placed a hand on her shoulder. No affection, only recognition. Soldier to soldier. You ride with me now. A nod. In that moment, the Apache gained a new warrior, and the United States Army had unknowingly earned its most unrelenting shadow. For every soldier that would come, tired, arrogant, hardened by battle, there would be one thing they could never understand. She didn't fight for glory. She didn't fight for revenge. She fought because the land had chosen her as its knife, and the knife had just begun to cut. The first lesson Lozen ever learned wasn't how to shoot. It was how to listen. Long before she held a rifle, she was trained in silence, forced to sit alone in the black canyons for hours, until the silence roared louder than thunder. It broke most children. But Lozen sat, still as death, her breath sinking with the desert's heartbeat. She began to hear things others couldn't. Not with ears, but with something older. Something buried deep in the blood. She could hear the creak of metal stirrups 6 miles away, the shift in air pressure before an ambush, the dreams of soldiers before they even set camp. Her mother said she had the sight. Her father said she had no soul. The elders called her a ghost walker. But Victorio saw it for what it was, warrior vision. While the boys trained with knives and bows, Lozen studied patterns, animal migrations, weather changes, footfall rhythms. She could read a broken twig like scripture. She knew how to find water where others saw dust. She knew which direction the wind would shift before it even moved. And she could sense betrayal. That was her deadliest skill. On a humid spring night when Lozen was barely 13, a cousin tried to sell Apache positions to a Mexican scout. He thought no one would know, but Lozen felt something. A flicker of wrongness in the camp, a chill in the firelight. That night, she followed him without sound, watched him pass the map, memorized every word exchanged in the dark. At dawn, Victorio called a meeting. The traitor denied everything until Lozen stepped forward and repeated in perfect detail every phrase spoken in the shadows. The cousin turned pale, tried to run. He didn't make it 20 feet. From that day on, the warriors no longer looked at her like a child. She wasn't the girl with a gift. She was a strategist, a tracker, a psychological weapon wrapped in the soft skin of youth. She learned to think like a snake, to anticipate, to corner, to kill without rage, only precision. Because while bullets can be dodged, minds cannot. And Lozen had the mind of a predator in the form of prey. The army had generals. The Apache had Lozen, and she was thinking 3 battles ahead. The first lesson Lozen ever learned wasn't how to shoot. It was how to listen. Long before she held a rifle, she was trained in silence, forced to sit alone in the black canyons for hours, until the silence roared louder than thunder. It broke most children. But Lozen sat, still as death, her breath sinking with the desert's heartbeat. She began to hear things others couldn't. Not with ears, but with something older. Something buried deep in the blood. She could hear the creak of metal stirrups 6 miles away, the shift in air pressure before an ambush, the dreams of soldiers before they even set camp. Her mother said she had the sight. Her father said she had no soul. The elders called her a ghost walker. But Victorio saw it for what it was, warrior vision. While the boys trained with knives and bows, Lozen studied patterns, animal migrations, weather changes, footfall rhythms. She could read a broken twig like scripture. She knew how to find water where others saw dust. She knew which direction the wind would shift before it even moved. And she could sense betrayal. That was her deadliest skill. On a humid spring night when Lozen was barely 13, a cousin tried to sell Apache positions to a Mexican scout. He thought no one would know, but Lozen felt something. A flicker of wrongness in the camp, a chill in the firelight. That night, she followed him without sound, watched him pass the map, memorized every word exchanged in the dark. At dawn, Victorio called a meeting. The traitor denied everything until Lozen stepped forward and repeated in perfect detail every phrase spoken in the shadows. The cousin turned pale, tried to run. He didn't make it 20 feet. From that day on, the warriors no longer looked at her like a child. She wasn't the girl with a gift. She was a strategist, a tracker, a psychological weapon wrapped in the soft skin of youth. She learned to think like a snake, to anticipate, to corner, to kill without rage, only precision. Because while bullets can be dodged, minds cannot. And Lozen had the mind of a predator in the form of prey. The army had generals. The Apache had Lozen, and she was thinking 3 battles ahead. To understand Lozen, you must understand the land that forged her. It wasn't just desert, it was bone. A vast skeleton of red rock and sharp silence where the sun burned holes through the weak. The Chiricahua Apache didn't merely live here, they endured. Every thorn, every vulture, every cracked stone taught them something. Survival is cruelty made holy. By the time she was 7, Lozen had seen men skinned alive by Mexican bounty hunters. By 9, she had watched a US cavalry officer shoot a grandmother in the back for refusing to kneel. By 10, she no longer cried when friends disappeared in the night, dragged off to the San Carlos Reservation, a place the elders called Hell Without Fire. She wasn't raised with lullabies, she was raised with stories of betrayal, starvation, genocide. The message was simple. The world does not want you to exist, and that knowledge gave her power. Every Apache child was taught to ride before they could walk, but Lozen rode differently. Not like a girl trying to prove something, but like someone who knew she would one day lead. She learned to fire from horseback, both hands, learned how to skin an animal, treat a wound, slit a throat, but these weren't just warrior skills, they were preparations for extinction. By the 1880s, the Chiricahua had been reduced from a proud nation to fugitives. Their warriors were outgunned, their women starved, their children hunted, and yet they fought. Because unlike the Americans, the Apache didn't fight for conquest. They fought for memory, for dignity, for vengeance. Lozen didn't play with dolls. She played with fire, literally. She'd build small ones in the caves, whisper to them, practice calling the spirits of the old mothers. It was said she could summon windstorms when angered, that her shadow sometimes moved independently in the moonlight. Whether myth or truth didn't matter. What mattered was fear. The soldiers began calling her Apache Witch, but they never saw her face, only the aftermath. A cavalry unit found one of their scouts impaled with a yucca stalk. No footprints, no tracks, just a single word carved into the rock, Lozen. She was no longer a girl. She was becoming a ghost that walked in daylight, a spirit carved from exile. And exile is where true killers are born. Among the Chiricahua, warriors were respected, but seers were feared. Lozen was both. It happened during her 12th summer. The tribe was camped along the Black Range, low on water, surrounded by hostile land, when a raiding party vanished on its return. No one knew if they had been captured, killed, or simply lost. The people were desperate. So her brother, Victorio, the war chief, did something he had never done before. He turned to a child. "Lozen," he said quietly, "see for me." She didn't question. She only stepped forward, barefoot, thin as hunger, eyes like cracked obsidian. She raised her arms, faced the east, whispered something ancient into the wind. Then she stood perfectly still. For hours. The old women began to murmur. This was no girl. This was something else. A vessel, a bone flute the spirits had chosen to play. When she finally spoke, her voice was colder than mountain stone. They are dead, near the canyon where the sun never rises. The ones who took them wear blue coats, but they bleed red. And she was right. Every detail, every direction, every prediction. From that day forward, Lozen was no longer treated as merely Victorio's sister. She was the shield woman, a prophet of war, a walking oracle. She could sense the enemy's direction without sight, could feel danger before it struck. Some said she could even hear the future. Victorio himself declared it. Lozen is my right hand, my eyes when I cannot see. But sacred gifts are also burdens. To be chosen by the spirits means to be marked by loneliness, by sacrifice, by the creeping chill of always being apart. She stopped laughing, stopped sleeping through the night. Every dream became a warning, every whisper a command. And slowly, even her own people began to step back. Reverence turned to fear, because when she entered the sweat lodge, no one else would. When she passed, dogs whimpered, and when she touched the earth, they swore it trembled. She hadn't asked for this, but the desert doesn't give you what you want, it gives you what you need to survive. And for Lozen, that meant becoming something less than human, and more than mortal. By 1879, the US Army had seen enough. Victorio's band was destroying everything in its path. Supply chains, outposts, border patrols, nothing was safe. They moved like ghosts through the mountains. But the real fear wasn't Victorio. It was the woman they whispered about. The one who could sense ambushes before they happened. The one whose rifle never missed. The one who could ride all night, fight all day, and never fall. They didn't know her name, but they called her the Demon Scout. She became a phantom in military briefings. We believe the enemy has a female operative, possibly a spiritual leader, highly dangerous, shoots to kill. But Lozen didn't just evade capture, she humiliated them. A cavalry unit once set a trap, baiting a mountain pass with false intel, hoping to corner her war party. Lozen entered the canyon alone. She dismounted, walked the path on foot, hands stretched to the sky. Then she stopped, eyes closed, mouth silent. Moments passed. Then she turned and vanished into the rocks. The cavalry waited days. No one came. When they finally moved forward, they found their own supply line looted. 100 mules gone, their food burning in a pile of embers, and carved into a tree, "You do not own the wind." That was her signature. Not a name, not a flag, just the truth. Because Lozen didn't just know the land, she was the land. She moved with the ridgelines. She read the silence of the birds. She could feel the vibration of enemy boots hours before they arrived. And for those who tried to track her, they found only empty footprints, scattered coals, and the echo of gunfire that never told where it came from. The army began recruiting Apache scouts to track her, but even they refused. "She's not a woman," one said. "She's the mountain's shadow," and the shadow was growing bolder. As Victorio's war spread, Lozen was no longer just a warrior or a prophet. She was becoming a myth. But behind the myth was a cost. A quiet grief she never showed. Because every time she closed her eyes to read the wind, she felt more blood waiting. And she knew, one day, it would be hers. Lozen had seen death, but she had never seen it like this. The year was 1880. Victorio had led one final campaign through the Black Range Mountains. 40 days of war, 40 nights of blood. And then, one morning, silence. The silence of betrayal. The Mexican army had caught them near Tres Castillos, surrounded them, outnumbered them, and this time, there was no escape. Over 60 Apaches were gunned down. Men, women, children. Victorio was found dead by his own hand, choosing suicide over surrender, the last bullet saved for himself. Lozen wasn't there. She had left just days earlier to guide a pregnant woman across enemy territory. She rode hundreds of miles to safety, only to return to ashes. Her brother, her blood, her war leader, gone. The US Army didn't even pull the triggers, but they celebrated like they had. The message was clear: Apache resistance was dying, and Lozen was alone. But something broke that day. Before, she fought with purpose. Now she fought with fury. She no longer moved like a shadow, she moved like a storm. She didn't hide from soldiers, she hunted them. She began riding with a new band, led by a fierce warrior named Nana, another elder of the Chihena. He was over 70 years old, but Lozen rode beside him like a second death. Together, they burned through the southwest like a plague. They didn't seek peace. They didn't want talks. They wanted revenge. Nana called her my right hand, but the soldiers called her something else now, the Apache executioner. She never spared, she never missed, and always she vanished before they could find her. They sent out fresh detachments, more scouts, more maps, more blood. But Lozen wasn't just fighting for the dead anymore. She was fighting for the unborn. Because in every ambush, in every bullet she fired, she wasn't thinking about revenge alone. She was thinking of the children who would never grow up free. The girls who would never touch the wind and call it sister. And so she rode, not to win, but to make sure the Empire never forgot that the land they stole still had guardians, and their names would be spoken in fear. He couldn't see well anymore. His joints ached with every ride. But Nana, the 74-year-old Apache war chief, wasn't done. Not yet. In 1881, the US government thought they had crushed the last Apache resistance. But then, something impossible happened. An old man with white hair rode down from the mountains, and behind him was a ghost. Lozen. She was supposed to be dead. She had vanished into the Sierra Madres, hunted by soldiers and bounty men alike. But like the wind, she returned. And this time, she rode not as a girl, not as Victorio's sister, but as Nana's executioner. For 12 weeks in the summer heat, they rained terror down on the American Southwest. They struck at night. They raided wagon trains, army outposts, and supply lines. They never stayed in one place longer than a breath. From New Mexico to Texas to Chihuahua, they rode over 1,000 miles in a spiral of death, with only 40 warriors, half of them wounded, some barely boys, and Lozen was their shield. She didn't just kill, she led. She scouted enemy positions like a hawk. She held off cavalry detachments while the others escaped. She tended wounds, whispered prayers, and some say, summoned the future. In one account, when they were being pursued through the desert, Lozen rode out alone, kneeled in the dirt, raised her arms to the sky, and fell silent. When she returned, she said, "There are many soldiers. They are coming from the south. We must move west." Hours later, the soldiers arrived, exactly from the south. There was no science behind it, just Lozen. They called it witchcraft. The Apache called it a gift, and it saved lives. Nana's campaign became one of the most legendary guerrilla runs in native history. By the end, they had killed dozens of soldiers, stolen hundreds of rifles and horses, and disappeared back into the mountains without a single death on their side. The US Mize literally called it a miraculous embarrassment. But Lozen didn't care about headlines. She wasn't chasing victory, she was keeping a promise, that as long as her blood ran hot, the mountains would never fall silent. No man could explain it, and no woman dared to imitate it. What Lozen did wasn't just strategy or luck, it was something older, something terrifying. Apache elders said she was born under a red moon, that her mother had wept blood during labor, that her first word wasn't a word, it was a scream that silenced coyotes. Some said the spirit of Usan, the creator, had whispered into her cradle. Others believed her soul had been marked by the ghosts of the slain. But Lozen didn't speak of spirits. She didn't need to. She was the spirit. She had no husband, no children, no homestead, only her horse, her rifle, and her war path. And yet, she had power over men, not with beauty, not with flirtation, but with presence. When she entered a tent, even hardened warriors fell quiet. They didn't gawk. They listened. Geronimo himself would later say, "She was braver than most men, strong as a man, and wise." But it was her silence that terrified people. Lozen could sit in absolute stillness for hours, not blinking, not moving, just feeling. She said it helped her sense the enemy's trail. But others whispered darker things, that she could see what wasn't there, that she knew the names of men she'd never met because she'd already killed them in her mind. A spiritual radar, a hunter's mind, a god's patience. And when the rifle didn't speak loud enough, she used a saber, sharp, close, personal. She preferred it that way. There are stories, half legend, half horror, of Lozen charging into a group of Texas Rangers alone. She didn't fire. She screamed, a high-pitched broken sound that rattled the horses and made grown men stumble. By the time she reached them, 2 were already fleeing. The rest didn't get the chance. Was it fear, madness, or something older? In Apache tradition, every tribe has its shield, a spirit incarnate sent to guard its soul. Lozen wasn't just a warrior. She was that shield, a woman forged in grief, hardened in fire. Blessed or cursed, with a mind that saw beyond men and mountains. She didn't want glory. She wanted vengeance, and she was just getting started. It didn't come with a roar, or a charge, or a trumpet. Her first kill came in silence. She was just 12. The scouts had returned. US cavalry was nearby, just 5 miles out. Moving slow, arrogant. They didn't expect resistance, and they certainly didn't expect her. Lozen had been watching, tracking, waiting. This wasn't a war party. It was a message. Obey, or we burn your village again. Lozen didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask her brother, didn't ask the elders. She saddled her horse and rode into the hills alone. She climbed high, above the trail the soldiers would take. She lay belly down on red stone, the desert sun turning her skin to flame. The wind shifted, dust clouds on the horizon. Then they came, marching, singing, laughing. She watched. She didn't blink. She let them pass. Then she moved, fast, down the ravine, silent as a shadow, cutting wide around the patrol. She chose the last rider. Not the officer, not the scout, the straggler, the lazy one. The one looking back at the mountains, not ahead at the mission. He never heard her. A war cry might have warned him. But Lozen gave him nothing, just steel, thrust under the ribs. The man gasped once, then dropped. She didn't loot, didn't gloat. She vanished. By the time the others noticed, Lozen was already back in the hills, and the message was sent. She wasn't aiming for the army. She was aiming for its soul. The next day, that patrol turned back, told their commander the terrain was too dangerous, that something wasn't right, that it felt cursed. The commander laughed. Lozen didn't. This was no random strike. It was the beginning, a declaration, not to the bluecoats but to herself. You are no longer a girl. You are the war. From that moment forward, no man in the US Army would ride in those hills without fear. No patrol would march without checking their rear, because Lozen had entered the war. And death had a new face, not a demon, not a beast, but a child, a silent one. Fort Bowie, Arizona. Summer, 1886. Brigadier General Nelson A. Miles leaned back in his canvas chair, squinting into the sun like a man surveying insects. His boots were polished, his orders clear. End this Apache nonsense. He had 55 scouts, 500 seasoned troops, repeating rifles, supply lines, and the railroad behind him like the spine of a machine god. He thought the war was already over. A few scattered raids, some dusty trails, maybe a bandit or two still playing warrior. Then the report came. A soldier stabbed, alone, slit clean, and left in the open like bait. His men whispered, "Geronimo's back. The spirits are angry. There's a she-demon in the rocks." Miles laughed, not the nervous laugh of a man unsure. The cold, mechanical chuckle of an Eastern tactician who believed war was math. More men, victory. He dismissed the kill as a fluke. A lucky ambush, some ghost story wrapped in native superstition. But then, a supply line vanished. Then a scout team disappeared. No bodies, just empty saddles found 3 days later by vultures. Miles stopped laughing. He ordered tighter formations. Scouts doubled, no riding alone, no sleeping without sentries. But it didn't matter. Every time his men moved, they were watched. Every time they stopped, something went missing. Boots, a rifle, a man. The Apache weren't fighting anymore. They were hunting, and at the center of it, unseen, was her, Lozen. She didn't crave blood. She didn't play at revenge. She calculated. She learned the patterns. She mapped their movements, and she struck only when she could make a point, not to win a skirmish, to win the mind. Miles began to lose sleep, his dreams filled with shadows in the rocks, with footsteps that weren't there, with the face of a child he'd never seen. He wrote to Washington, "This is not a war, it's a haunting." But still, he pushed forward. And Lozen. She didn't wait. She was already planning the next strike, one that would make the US military question not just how to fight her, but whether they should have started at all. To track an army, you need numbers. To defeat an army, you need fear. But to haunt an army, you need silence. Lozen understood this. She knew the US troops marched like cattle, uniformed, predictable, blind to the land beneath their boots. But Lozen, she felt the land. She didn't just walk the canyons, she listened to them. Each rock, each tree, each wind-carved ridge was a whisper, a signal, a code. She knew the ghost paths, secret trails only the elders spoke of. Paths that bent around time, where horses left no tracks and men vanished without footprints. The kind of places even the Apache entered with prayers. Lozen learned them before she was 10. She memorized not just the turns but the stories, where lightning had struck twice, where a warrior once leapt 30 feet to avoid capture, where a mother buried her child and the wind still wept in that place. These were her maps, and no army had a compass for them. One night, as the moon hung low and red like a bleeding eye, Lozen moved alone. She carried a stolen rifle, a soldier's knife tucked behind her belt, and something deeper, the memory of her brother's oath, the promise that she too would die free or not at all. She crossed the dry riverbed that led to Apache Pass. The soldiers had set up camp nearby, 5 tents, a cooking fire, and 2 guards too bored to care. Lozen didn't attack. She walked past them, just outside their line of sight, bare feet moving soundless on stone. She marked their water barrels. She counted the rifles. She tasted the ashes in the wind and knew how fresh their fire was. Then she vanished back into the dark. The next morning, 2 of the soldiers would awaken to find strange carvings etched into the rocks nearby. Symbols they couldn't read, old tribal warnings. They laughed, until one found a strand of long black hair tied around the trigger of his rifle. He didn't laugh after that. The ghost path wasn't just a trail, it was a message. You are not welcome here, and someone is watching. They thought she was a myth, a fever dream whispered by half-dead scouts and trembling survivors. But soon, the myth began to multiply. Word spread fast across the desert forts. Camp Bowie, Fort Apache, Fort Huachuca. Always the same whisper. A girl, a warrior, a ghost in the rocks. Some said she could read minds. Others claimed she could vanish in broad daylight. One grizzled sergeant insisted she had no shadow. What they didn't understand was simple. Lozen wasn't hiding in the desert. She was the desert. She moved with it, slept in the arms of its cliffs, ate what it gave her, killed with what it grew. And as the soldiers marched deeper into Apache territory, guided by faulty maps and arrogant commands, they began to notice something unsettling. Their compasses spun, their water went foul, their horses bucked and cried at night, and their men began to vanish, one at a time. No gunshots, no footprints, just silence. And the echo of war cries carried on the wind, like old ghosts screaming through the canyons. That was Lozen. But she didn't just kill, she calculated. She learned their patrol patterns. She read their faces from cliff edges, judging fear levels like a predator. She stole maps, unraveled supply lines, sabotaged signal lanterns, switched gunpowder with black sand. And sometimes, she left no blood, just symbols, chalked onto stones, carved into bark. Apache runes only she and Geronimo could read, symbols that meant, "This is not your land. You are already dead." By the time spring rolled across the borderlands, entire regiments had changed their routes just to avoid the shadow of the Sierra Madres. One colonel put it bluntly, "It's not the tribes we fear, it's the one we can't see." And deep in the mountains, a girl of 15 sat with a stolen journal in her lap, reading their strategies, marking their blind spots, learning how they thought. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, she simply whispered, "I know you now." Because Lozen understood something no commander ever did. Fear wasn't a weapon, it was a disease, and she was its carrier. They thought she was a myth, a fever dream whispered by half-dead scouts and trembling survivors. But soon, the myth began to multiply. Word spread fast across the desert forts. Camp Bowie, Fort Apache, Fort Huachuca. Always the same whisper. A girl, a warrior, a ghost in the rocks. Some said she could read minds. Others claimed she could vanish in broad daylight. One grizzled sergeant insisted she had no shadow. What they didn't understand was simple. Lozen wasn't hiding in the desert. She was the desert. She moved with it, slept in the arms of its cliffs, ate what it gave her, killed with what it grew. And as the soldiers marched deeper into Apache territory, guided by faulty maps and arrogant commands, they began to notice something unsettling. Their compasses spun, their water went foul, their horses bucked and cried at night, and their men began to vanish, one at a time. No gunshots, no footprints, just silence. And the echo of war cries carried on the wind, like old ghosts screaming through the canyons. That was Lozen. But she didn't just kill, she calculated. She learned their patrol patterns. She read their faces from cliff edges, judging fear levels like a predator. She stole maps, unraveled supply lines, sabotaged signal lanterns, switched gunpowder with black sand. And sometimes, she left no blood, just symbols, chalked onto stones, carved into bark. Apache runes only she and Geronimo could read, symbols that meant, "This is not your land. You are already dead." By the time spring rolled across the borderlands, entire regiments had changed their routes just to avoid the shadow of the Sierra Madres. One colonel put it bluntly, "It's not the tribes we fear, it's the one we can't see." And deep in the mountains, a girl of 15 sat with a stolen journal in her lap, reading their strategies, marking their blind spots, learning how they thought. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, she simply whispered, "I know you now." Because Lozen understood something no commander ever did. Fear wasn't a weapon, it was a disease, and she was its carrier. The desert had turned against them, but Washington didn't care. To the men in polished boots and walnut-paneled war rooms, this was just a setback, just hostile resistance. A problem to be solved, with fire. The orders came down like thunder. Break them. Burn everything. Spare nothing. They wanted Geronimo. They wanted the Apache. But more than anything, they wanted her. The girl warrior, the ghost, the one who moved faster than sound and struck harder than truth. So they unleashed General Nelson A. Miles, decorated, calculating, a man with no love for glory, only results. He brought 5,000 troops. Helicopters didn't exist, so they used heliographs, sun-reflecting mirrors flashing coded messages across mountains. He built a war web so wide it stretched from Arizona to Mexico, and he made one rule: no escape. Villages were burned, hunting grounds poisoned, water sources fouled with slaughtered deer, and still, Lozen moved. At night she led families through the scrublands under moonless skies. During the day she hunted soldiers like a spirit with no mercy, but the army had changed its tactics. No more foolish marches, no more lone patrols. Now they sent scouts, Apache men, bought or broken, tracking their own blood. It was psychological warfare, and Lozen felt it. At 16 she was now both warrior and strategist, but she was also bone-thin, sleep-starved, riddled with desert sickness. She was a blade, sharp but worn. Then came the ambush near Skeleton Canyon. Miles's men surrounded an entire band of Apache, sealing every ridge and pass. Dozens were taken. One young warrior, speared through the thigh, screamed her name into the dust. "Lozen!" She heard it, but she didn't answer. She was already crawling through a dry arroyo with a baby strapped to her chest and a stolen Colt revolver clenched in her teeth. The soldiers missed her by minutes, but they found something else. A pouch. Inside, a map, hand-drawn in charcoal, a symbol at its center, 3 circles, each one darker than the last. No one knew what it meant, but when General Miles saw it, his face went cold. He whispered, "She's still out there." Because by now he understood. This wasn't war anymore. This was a hunt, and Lozen was the wolf. The generals weren't sleeping. They'd buried too many men to call this just another campaign. By summer's end, more than 400 soldiers were dead. Some simply vanished, never found. No bones, no boots, just silence. The Apache called it Lozen's breath. A death you didn't see coming, a whisper on your neck, and then nothing. In Fort Bowie, the whispers turned to meetings, private ones. Behind locked doors, under the American flag, a new strategy was born, not from military manuals, but from panic. They called in the Shadow Council. No official records, no uniforms, just influence, railroad tycoons, silver barons, and men with eyes too cold for their age. To them, Lozen wasn't just a girl with a rifle. She was a threat to expansion. She threatened the entire machinery of manifest destiny. And if she wasn't stopped, others might rise. So they reached for something older than bullets. Myths, fears, the ancient sickness of power. One man, Colonel Lambert Hale, stood up during a closed meeting. formerly of the Pinkertons, now head of suppression logistics. He opened a briefcase. Inside was a bundle of black feathers, tied with a red cord. A hush fell over the room. He said, "We don't need to kill her. We need to turn her into a ghost that even her people fear." That was the new plan: psychological erasure. Turn her into a demon, a walking curse, a symbol of madness, not resistance. They started by planting stories, articles in Eastern newspapers claiming she drank blood, that she danced naked with snakes, that her mother was a witch and her father was a Spanish priest. All lies. But they spread like wildfire. Even some Apaches huddled in caves began to whisper, "Is she still with the spirits, or has she become one?" Meanwhile, Lozen watched from the shadows. She knew something had shifted. The bullets didn't scare her. The death squads didn't shake her. But this slow war on meaning, this infection of belief, it was worse than fire. Because once your people stop believing you're real, you don't have to die. They kill you in their minds. They burned her name into the desert. But Lozen wouldn't vanish, because the elders still remembered. They called a meeting beneath a moonless sky deep in the Sierra Madres. Not warriors, not rebels, but medicine men. What they summoned that night wasn't war, it was memory. One by one, they passed a bowl carved from obsidian. Each whispered her name into it, then crushed sage, then ashes, then blood. When it was Lozen's turn, she didn't speak. She stared into the black bowl for nearly an hour, and then, in the dead silence, she said, "They want to make me a ghost. Let me show them what a ghost can do." That night, she became more than a girl with a rifle. She became legend in motion. The Apache called it Tsin Ta Nadzili, the fire speaker. It meant more than warrior. It meant one who walks through lies without being burned. She stopped attacking soldiers directly. Instead, she attacked belief systems. She started appearing in 2 places at once. At least, that's what the scouts reported. One moment, she was seen near Tucson. Then, hours later, she ambushed a supply train near Chihuahua. How? She'd weaponized perception. One band of women would dress like her, same braids, same horse, same war paint. Meanwhile, the real Lozen moved in silence, with a map carved into bone. She began targeting communication lines. Not just physical wires, but the human lines, couriers, translators, the scouts who bridged tribes and government. She turned the US Army deaf, then blind, then paranoid. Entire squads were sent chasing shadows, following trails that looped back on themselves. Some swore they heard her voice calling out in English, Spanish, and Apache from 3 different directions at once. Men went mad. One private, found wandering barefoot through the canyon, kept repeating, "She's not a woman, she's thunder on 2 legs." The war was no longer fought with bullets. It was fought with doubt, awe, and ritual. And Lozen? She didn't need to win every battle. She only needed to make sure the enemy stopped believing they ever could. That was how empires fall, not with explosions, but with unanswered questions in the dark. By spring of 1886, whispers echoed across the Southwest. Not orders, not treaties. Whispers, the kind soldiers didn't repeat above a murmur, the kind that make a man question the shape of reality. They called it the death whisper, a sound in the wind, soft as breath, heavy as fate. Some said it was just wind through yucca. Others said it was Lozen herself, speaking to the bones of men before they died. What mattered wasn't truth. What mattered was that fear had a face now, and it wore the braids of a teenage girl. Entire regiments began refusing assignments near the Chiricahua Range. One lieutenant wrote in his journal, "We are no longer fighting natives. We are fighting ghosts, and they are winning." Meanwhile, General Nelson Miles, the man sent to finish what Crook couldn't, he watched the war turn sideways. Every skirmish became a riddle. Every footprint split into 3 trails. Every ambush ended before it began. And behind it all, Lozen, not in the open, not anymore. She was now a myth made strategic, an idea that burned in the back of every soldier's mind. Kill one Apache? Fine. But what if it was her? What if you missed? What if she's already behind you? Even seasoned scouts grew jumpy. Some wouldn't ride at night, some wouldn't speak her name. Because by now, her name had become a weapon. Lozen. It meant lightning that bends. It meant the blade in your dream. It meant the girl who rode with God and war in her hands. The army sent trackers. They vanished. They bribed rival tribes. The rivals turned back, whispering, "You cannot hunt what is already inside you." Because Lozen wasn't just beating them on the battlefield, she was infecting their imagination. And in warfare, that's the final frontier. When the enemy starts dreaming you've already won. But Lozen didn't celebrate. She knew what was coming, because her visions were hanging. No longer just movement and warpaths, but something darker. Smoke without fire. Silence without peace. A final shadow that would demand more than strategy. It would demand her soul. By spring of 1886, whispers echoed across the Southwest. Not orders, not treaties. Whispers, the kind soldiers didn't repeat above a murmur, the kind that make a man question the shape of reality. They called it the death whisper, a sound in the wind, soft as breath, heavy as fate. Some said it was just wind through yucca. Others said it was Lozen herself, speaking to the bones of men before they died. What mattered wasn't truth. What mattered was that fear had a face now, and it wore the braids of a teenage girl. Entire regiments began refusing assignments near the Chiricahua Range. One lieutenant wrote in his journal, "We are no longer fighting natives. We are fighting ghosts, and they are winning." Meanwhile, General Nelson Miles, the man sent to finish what Crook couldn't, he watched the war turn sideways. Every skirmish became a riddle. Every footprint split into 3 trails. Every ambush ended before it began. And behind it all, Lozen, not in the open, not anymore. She was now a myth made strategic, an idea that burned in the back of every soldier's mind. Kill one Apache? Fine. But what if it was her? What if you missed? What if she's already behind you? Even seasoned scouts grew jumpy. Some wouldn't ride at night, some wouldn't speak her name. Because by now, her name had become a weapon. Lozen. It meant lightning that bends. It meant the blade in your dream. It meant the girl who rode with God and war in her hands. The army sent trackers. They vanished. They bribed rival tribes. The rivals turned back, whispering, "You cannot hunt what is already inside you." Because Lozen wasn't just beating them on the battlefield, she was infecting their imagination. And in warfare, that's the final frontier. When the enemy starts dreaming you've already won. But Lozen didn't celebrate. She knew what was coming, because her visions were hanging. No longer just movement and warpaths, but something darker. Smoke without fire. Silence without peace. A final shadow that would demand more than strategy. It would demand her soul. May 1886. The Arizona sun was boiling skin off bone. Geronimo and his remaining warriors, just 37 people total, counting women and children, were being hunted by 5,000 US troops, 500 Apache scouts, and an invisible clock that ticked down toward annihilation. Lozen was one of the last standing. Still just a teenager, but she had the cold eyes of a field surgeon. She could ride 70 miles without water. She could shoot from horseback without touching the reins. And she had a gift, that unnatural, terrifying gift. She could feel the shape of death before it arrived. It was that sense that saved them, again and again. Every time a patrol got close, Lozen would ride to a peak, touch the earth, and mutter in Apache, eyes rolling back, listening to what no one else could hear. They come, 2 days, 40 strong, from the east. And they would vanish. One time, Lozen led them through a canyon so narrow, most horses had to be walked sideways. No one else would have risked it. But Lozen didn't hesitate. Behind them, US cavalry. Ahead, sheer rock, blistered sun, no water for 50 miles. They followed her anyway. And somehow, they survived. Not because of numbers, not because of weapons. Because Lozen was untouchable. But she was not unbreakable. That summer, her brother Victorio's memory haunted her. So did the children she had to leave behind. So did the knowledge that the Apache way of life, the old way, was dying faster than any bullet could kill it. Every night she slept under the stars. The wind whispered a new truth. You will outlive this war, but not your people. And Lozen knew. This wasn't about killing soldiers anymore. It was about carrying the spirit of resistance even when the flesh failed, even when the fight was no longer winnable. That's what made her terrifying. She wasn't fighting for survival. She was fighting to outlast extinction. And the Ents, Amy felt that. Because when a soldier faces death, he fights with his hands. But when a girl faces the death of her entire people, she fights with her soul. And the soul does not miss. Not when it burns like Lozen's. General Nelson A. Miles was no fool. He'd crushed resistance across the plains, put Sitting Bull on the run, outmaneuvered the best warriors in North America. But now, he found himself chasing a ghost in the desert, and that ghost was a teenage girl. Lozen. Every dispatch he received carried some version of her name. Not Geronimo's, not Natchez's, hers. She wasn't just outmaneuvering patrols, she was making a mockery of the entire US military campaign. Every trap they set, she unraveled it. Every position they fortified, she bypassed it. Every ambush turned into a massacre of her design. He called in Apache scouts. They know her mind, he said. They'll help me break her. But they didn't. Many refused to pursue her. Not because they feared death, but because they feared what she represented. See, Lozen had become more than a person. She was now a symbol. A walking wound that reminded every Apache scout of who they once were and what they betrayed. One scout confessed in private, "She is the one our grandmothers sang about, the one who speaks to the earth, the one who walks without sound." Miles grew desperate. He increased bounties, threatened deserters with execution, sent false messages to lure her in. Nothing worked. Because Lozen was still riding with Geronimo's last band, still feeding women and children, still warning of patrols, still ready to kill without hesitation. But she was also tired. The visions came more erratically now. The land grew harsher, and the noose was tightening. General Miles watched as weeks turned into months. And still, he couldn't lay a finger on her. Not because he lacked power, but because power means nothing to someone who has nothing left to lose. That's what haunted him. This wasn't a girl fighting for victory. This was a girl fighting to delay extinction, one heartbeat at a time, and deep down Miles realized something no officer would say out loud. I am not chasing a rebel, I am chasing a prophecy. Because how do you kill a legend that's still alive? How do you stop the wind from whispering her name? You don't. You just hope she dies before you have to face her. By the summer of 1886, the desert had become a furnace, not just of heat, but of fate. Lozen's band, what was left of it, was starving. Children wept in silence. Women chewed leather to fight off hunger. Even Geronimo looked different now. Older, hollowed out, but his eyes still searched the horizon like they were reading scripture. He knew. The end was near. They had evaded US and Mexican troops for over a year, a feat historians still call impossible, but now supplies were gone. Their horses were collapsing under them. Even the sacred plants couldn't mask the smell of blood and desperation. They were being hunted not just by soldiers, but by time itself. Lozen no longer slept. She stood watch night after night, muttering to the stars. Sometimes, she didn't even need her rituals anymore. She felt the enemy coming. Through the rocks, through the wind, through the trembling silence of children who no longer asked, "Are we safe?" And then it happened. A message came from the Apache scouts who once served her people, now turned American mercenaries. A message offering mercy from General Miles. Surrender, and the killing would stop. Geronimo gathered the last warriors around a fire. Lozen sat beside him, silent, a blade in her lap. He asked them all one question: do we die free in the mountains, or live as prisoners beneath the flag? Silence. Then an old man spoke. "We are bones already. Let us leave our children something more than bones." And so, the unthinkable happened. Geronimo agreed to meet Miles at Skeleton Canyon. But Lozen, she didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just stood, walked to her horse, and rode to the edge of a cliff. Witnesses say she raised her hands to the sky. And for the first time in a year, no vision came. Nothing but wind. Nothing but the long, final breath of a world collapsing in on itself. 'Cause the circle had closed, and no prophecy could outrun extinction. Still, she rode back. Because even in surrender, Lozen knew, a warrior doesn't choose victory. A warrior chooses presence, until the last fire goes out. The surrender at Skeleton Canyon wasn't a ceremony, it was a dissection. Geronimo stood in silence. Lozen stood behind him, her face carved from stone. General Nelson A. Miles, trimmed mustache, polished boots, a man who believed in manifest destiny, greeted them with the posture of a banker finalizing foreclosure. There was no honor, just ink, paper, and rifles aimed at children. The Apache resistance was over. Geronimo's warriors were sent east, separated from their families, treated like dangerous animals. Lozen was shackled, not metaphorically, physically, steel around her wrists, iron at her ankles. The same woman who once rode through bullets and thunder, now chained like a criminal. A US soldier reportedly whispered, "This one's not like the rest. Look at her eyes." Lozen didn't flinch. She stared directly into the heart of the machine that had crushed her people, and said nothing. No curses, no tears, only stillness. Because silence was her last weapon. They loaded her onto a train bound for Florida, the land of swamps, humidity, and prison camps. She had never seen the ocean before, never heard the sound of seagulls circling a land where nothing grew free. In her homeland, the land listened. In Florida, the land was deaf. She was confined in a cell at Fort Marion, the same dungeon used to break warriors from the Great Plains and the Southwest. There was no fire here, no rituals, no visions, just stone walls and the echo of a nation trying to erase her. And yet, Lozen survived. Even as her body weakened, her presence never did. Other prisoners said she still rose before dawn, still whispered to the sun, still pressed her ear to the earth, even if that earth was concrete. She became a ghost in a living body, not broken, not tamed, just waiting. Because deep inside she knew the war had never been about land or gold or politic. It had always been about the killing of memory. And as long as she remembered, They would never truly win. The surrender at Skeleton Canyon wasn't a ceremony, it was a dissection. Geronimo stood in silence. Lozen stood behind him, her face carved from stone. General Nelson A. Miles, trimmed mustache, polished boots, a man who believed in manifest destiny, greeted them with the posture of a banker finalizing foreclosure. There was no honor, just ink, paper, and rifles aimed at children. The Apache resistance was over. Geronimo's warriors were sent east, separated from their families, treated like dangerous animals. Lozen was shackled, not metaphorically, physically, steel around her wrists, iron at her ankles. The same woman who once rode through bullets and thunder, now chained like a criminal. A US soldier reportedly whispered, "This one's not like the rest. Look at her eyes." Lozen didn't flinch. She stared directly into the heart of the machine that had crushed her people, and said nothing. No curses, no tears, only stillness. Because silence was her last weapon. They loaded her onto a train bound for Florida, the land of swamps, humidity, and prison camps. She had never seen the ocean before, never heard the sound of seagulls circling a land where nothing grew free. In her homeland, the land listened. In Florida, the land was deaf. She was confined in a cell at Fort Marion, the same dungeon used to break warriors from the Great Plains and the Southwest. There was no fire here, no rituals, no visions, just stone walls and the echo of a nation trying to erase her. And yet, Lozen survived. Even as her body weakened, her presence never did. Other prisoners said she still rose before dawn, still whispered to the sun, still pressed her ear to the earth even if that earth was concrete. She became a ghost in a living body, not broken, no, tamed, just waiting. Because deep inside she knew. The war had never been about land, or gold, or politics. It had always been about the killing of memory, and as long as she remembered, the Fort Marion was a tomb for the defiant. Stone walls thick enough to mute rebellion, thicker still to muffle memory. The US military didn't just imprison Apache warriors. They sought to erase them, not just from the land but from time itself. No records, no monuments, no names etched in history books, only silence. Lozen, once called the shield of her people, was now called Prisoner 154. Her name stripped, her language forbidden, her ceremonies banned. They gave her army rations and expected her to forget. Forget the sacred mountains, forget the wind's voice, forget the screams of the children she buried. Forget the songs of war, the laughter of Firelight, the feeling of horse muscle beneath her during a raid. But Lozen's memory was not theirs to kill. In darkness, she whispered stories to the other women, stories of battles, spirits, visions, of her brother's prophecies, of the gods that still walked the desert. And she taught the girls, Apache girls born in chains, how to listen, how to kneel in silence and feel the pulse of the land, even if that land was poisoned. To some guards, she seemed harmless, just a small woman growing older in a prison dress. But the officers, the men who had studied her file, read the reports from Chihuahua, Tres Castillos, San Carlos. They knew better. They watched her closely. Even in chains, she disturbed them. Because power doesn't come from position, it comes from presence. And Lozen's presence made men uneasy. She was a living contradiction. A woman who had outwitted cavalry scouts, who had walked alone through deserts filled with enemies, who had led men into battle and brought them back alive. Now, in a damp stone cell, still leading, still resisting, not with bullets, but with breath. They had taken her weapons, her horse, her freedom, but they couldn't take the story. That she carried inside her, and every night as the guards walked past her cell, they said she looked like she was waiting for something or someone. They didn't know. She wasn't waiting. She was remembering, and that was more dangerous than any rifle. The war was over, but peace never came. Not for the Apache, not for Lozen, not for the land. The American government had promised protection. Instead, they delivered isolation. Men like General Nelson Miles smiled for photographs, spoke of civilizing the savage, spoke of honor. But in back rooms, the same men rewrote maps with red lines, lines that bled through entire nations. Lozen and her people had surrendered under the promise of return. A return to San Carlos, to Arizona, to the lands they were born on. But that promise was broken. In secret orders and railroad schedules, the Apache prisoners were not going home. They were being exiled deeper, to Florida, Alabama, and finally, Mount Vernon Barracks. A swamp, mosquitoes thick as smoke, drinking water laced with rot, children dying before their second birthday. This was not relocation. This was calculated suffocation, and Lozen saw it. Every morning she stood and counted the sick. Every night she watched another fire go out. This was the betrayal that broke something deeper than bone. It broke trust. It broke meaning. Not with bullets, not with beatings, but with silence. Because betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it hands you bread and tells you you're free, as long as you never leave. Some warriors tried to adapt. Some turned to Christianity. Some begged. Lozen did none of that. She remained stoic. But inside, her vision was clearer than ever. This wasn't just about territory. This was about domination of the spirit. They didn't want the Apache to die quickly. They wanted them to dissolve, to vanish into nothingness, to forget they ever rode through valleys like thunder, to forget they once stood between empire and extinction. And Lozen, the girl who once rode through the blood of 600 soldiers, now walked barefoot among the sick. She whispered old chants into dying ears. She traced protective symbols on the foreheads of fevered children. She buried bones when no one else would. She did not lead warriors now. She led ghosts. And even the army, with all its reports and rifles, could not measure what that meant. Because some forms of resistance aren't loud. Some are made of silence, the kind that haunts forever. By 1889, Lozen was no longer a warrior on horseback, but she was still fighting. Only now, her battlefield was quieter, colder, and crawling with something far more merciless than bullets: tuberculosis. The white man called it consumption, but for the Apache it had no name, only a presence. A slow, invisible shadow that crept into lungs, crushed ribs from the inside, and left warriors coughing up pieces of themselves. Lozen knew it had come for her. She could feel it, not in her visions, but in her breath. Every step now felt like climbing a mountain. Every cough tasted like rust. And yet, she still walked the perimeter of the barracks, still watched over the sick, still stood at the edge of the world where memory meets myth. Because she understood something the soldiers never did, that surrender is a language, and she refused to speak it. In the mornings, she sang to the sun, not prayers of salvation, but war chants, old ones, the kind that once echoed off canyon walls as warriors painted their faces with ash and readied themselves to kill gods in human form. She sang not to be heard, but to be remembered, because they had taken her land, her people, her future, but they would not take her echo. Children watched her from behind crates and crates of spoiled flour. They didn't understand the words, but they felt something in them, like a rumble under the skin, like a fire still glowing in the bones of the earth. Lozen had no rifle now, no horse, no blade, but she still carried her medicine. And one night, When the coughing grew so violent it bent her in half, she didn't cry out. She sat upright, faced west, and began to chant again. Her voice cracked. Her lungs burned, but the sound came anyway. It wasn't melody, it wasn't beauty, it was defiance, distilled. And when it ended, so did she. Lozen, last of the Apache war women, died not with a scream, but with a whisper sharp enough to cut through time. The guards recorded it as another death, a line on a page, a prisoner expired, but the wind still carries her chant, for those willing to listen. After Lozen's death, the government did what it always did to people it feared. It erased her. There would be no statue, no monument, no school named in her honor. Her grave, if it existed, was never marked. No priest, no sermon, no flag folded into the trembling hands of kin, just a body in the dust under a sky that had forgotten how to weep. She had lived with fury in her chest and visions in her skull. But history has no patience for women like her, especially not brown women, especially not warriors. The same generals who once sent entire columns to track her, who whispered her name with clenched jaws, now they acted like she was a myth, a ghost. And maybe she was. Maybe she always had been. A spirit slipped from the mouth of the mountain gods, given flesh for a brief moment, only to vanish before the white man could cage her soul. For decades, her story lay buried, not by time, but by silence. And silence is the most brutal weapon of all. You can kill a body with a bullet, but you kill a legacy with forgetting. The records mentioned Geronimo. They mentioned Victorio. But Lozen? She became a footnote, a shadow in the margins, a name spoken in tribal circles, but rarely printed in ink. And yet, some remembered. Elders told her tale in fireside whispers. Children repeated it while drawing arrows in the dirt. A girl with the power to feel death before it came. A warrior who rode through bullets like wind. A woman who became more than flesh. Not because she wanted fame, but because she refused to break. Even in chains, even in sickness. Even as the world tried to write her out. Because stories like hers, they don't die. They just wait. Buried under layers of lies, beneath the monuments to the men who killed her people. And when the wind is just right, when the bones of the earth start to sing again, you'll hear her, not with your ears, but with something deeper, a pulse, a war drum in your own blood. Lozen's name may have been buried, but her blood didn't vanish. It flowed into the veins of children raised on exile and thunder, into the dreams of girls who never saw a homeland, but still felt its dust in their lungs. There were whispers in the desert that Lozen had been reborn, not in flesh, but in fire. In every Apache woman who dared to look a man in the eye, who carried babies on her back and rifles on her hip, who sang the old songs when it was illegal to speak her own tongue. You see, they couldn't kill her power, because her power didn't come from weapons or muscle. It came from alignment, from living in lockstep with something ancient, older than the United States, older than Spain, older than the crosses they nailed into the land. Lozen was the child of rhythm and pattern, of earth, storm, and sacrifice. The settlers had compasses. She had instinct. The soldiers had maps. She had the pulse of the soil. The generals made plans. She felt death before it came. And when she died, that current didn't stop. It just flowed elsewhere. Into songs sung in secret. Into prayers whispered to mountain spirits. Into the resistance movements of later centuries. Because make no mistake, Lozen's story didn't end in 1887. She became an ancestor, a signal, a kind of underground frequency. You can still feel her when a girl refuses to lower her eyes, when a people refuse to disappear, when a language is spoken again after being outlawed for generations. She lives in the hum between moments, in the breath before battle, in the tremble of the earth before it splits open. America tried to forget her. But forgetting is a lie the land won't keep. And the land remembers Lozen. Every time a storm rolls through New Mexico, every time thunder cracks across the empty sky, every time a woman walks alone and unafraid into danger, there she is. Not a ghost, not a legend, not a victim, but a warning and a promise. The United States does not remember Lozen, not officially, no statues, no school books, no national holiday. But that's not a glitch. It's design, because what Lozen represented was everything the American experiment could not afford to honor. She wasn't just a warrior, she was an indictment. A girl who outwitted generals, who slipped through nets of steel and gunpowder, who fought for no king, no flag, no personal gain, just land, spirit, and people. That kind of defiance doesn't get memorialized, it gets erased, rewritten. She becomes a myth, a medicine woman. They use soft words to dull the edge of her memory, as if she were some dusty legend, not a military strategist, not a lethal force of resistance. They want her to be folklore, not evidence. Because if Lozen is real, then so is everything she fought against, and so is everything America tried to do to silence her. Take a long look at the archives. Her name flickers briefly in military reports. Female combatant seen with Geronimo. Woman spotted leading breakaway group. Then gone, vanished into redacted silence. But history isn't a library, it's a battleground, and Lozen's memory is still at war. Why? Because memory, true memory, is dangerous. It threatens the version of events written by the victors, and America needs its victors clean, its stories simple. Cowboys and Indians, good guys and savages, civilization and wilderness. Lozen burned that script. She didn't fit the role. She wasn't a noble savage. She wasn't a helpless girl. She was the storm that refused to be forecasted. And so, the textbooks don't mention her. The museums gloss her over. The presidents never speak her name. But forgetfulness doesn't last forever. The soil remembers. The sky remembers. And the descendants of those who walked with her, they remember too. In the face of every Apache grandmother who teaches her grandchildren how to track stars. In the stories told around dying fires. In the unshakable truth that somewhere, a girl once stood alone against the most powerful empire in the hemisphere and made it bleed. It was winter when they caught her. The mountains held their breath. The earth turned gray. Lozen, still just in her early 20s, was captured after months of evading death, after leading, surviving, and outmaneuvering what should have killed her a dozen times over. But iron doesn't listen to spirit, and bullets don't care how brave you are. She and the last remnants of her people were sent east, chained, shackled, loaded onto cattle cars as if they were livestock. The final fire, the US military called it, their last push to break the back of what was left of Apache resistance. But Lozen didn't break. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Witnesses said her eyes remained defiant, even as they marched her through towns where white children pointed and laughed, even as soldiers jeered, mocking this little girl warrior who had once made them sweat blood in the desert. What they didn't know was that Lozen was already dying. Not from wounds, from tuberculosis. The same disease that consumed so many who were ripped from their homelands, their medicine, their air. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, was a prison wrapped in mud and fog. It was there, far from her mountains, far from the winds that once carried her visions, that Lozen lay down for the last time. No war drums, no battle cries, no ceremony. She just stopped breathing. She was maybe 23. No grave marker, no recorded last words, no military acknowledgement. But if you ask the wind around Fort Sill, you might still hear it. The whisper of a girl who refused to die as a victim. She didn't fade out. She became myth, not because of exaggeration, but because myth is what happens when truth burns too bright to be buried. In death, the US got what it wanted: silence. But in that silence, a different voice grew louder, the voice of every girl who's ever been underestimated, every spirit that refused to kneel, every fire they tried to drown in mud. Lozen didn't get a monument. She became one. They feared what she left behind. Not weapons, not maps, not armies. They feared her example. Because Lozen proved something that power doesn't want remembered, that dominance can be challenged not by numbers, not by wealth, but by a single person with unshakable clarity. She didn't just fight men. She fought the idea that they were untouchable. She exposed a system built on conquest by refusing to be conquered. And long after her body was buried without a stone, her legacy began whispering through time, like smoke through the cracks of a burning empire. Think of every young girl told she's too small, too weak, too emotional to stand against what's coming. And then think of Lozen, outnumbered 100-1, but still standing. Think of the soldiers, not the nameless thousands, but the ones who survived her raids, who watched friends vanish in the desert, who knew, even if they never said it, that something was hunting them with eyes like obsidian and footsteps that left no trail. They feared her power, not just to kill, but to exist, because she didn't ask permission, didn't wait for validation, didn't conform to what a woman, a warrior, or a human was supposed to be. And that's why the records tried to erase her, why generals lied, why history bent itself backward to forget her name. But names like hers aren't meant to be buried. They're meant to be passed like fire. Lozen isn't a page in history. She's a weapon buried beneath it. Every woman who resists, every soul that refuses to be broken, every time someone chooses the impossible fight over the comfortable lie, that's Lozen. They feared her legacy because it was contagious, because a child who walks into gunfire and refuses to die can't be forgotten forever. You're hearing this now because the silence failed, the lie failed, and the girl they tried to vanish. She's standing in your mind, a shadow with eyes full of lightning, asking one thing: what will you do with the fire she left behind? Lozen died in 1889, imprisoned, diseased, starved of the land that once fed her soul. There were no drums, no feathers, no horses circling under a desert moon, just silence. Not because she was unloved, but because her death was too dangerous to mourn. To the US government, her body meant closure, an end, a ticking time bomb diffused. But to the Apache, and to those who understood what she really was, her death wasn't an ending. It was a transfer of power. You see, in their mythology, death doesn't dissolve warriors. It distills them. Lozen became smoke, wind, lightning in the belly of storms. They feared that even in death, she would rise in dreams, in rebellion, in whispers passed from mother to daughter and son to brother. And they were right. Because even now, in the archives of those who tried to erase her, you'll find her name scratched out, overwritten, buried under paperwork and lies. Not because she was insignificant, but because she was too significant. They hid her because she cracked the myth, the one they built around conquest, hierarchy, and control. That myth says heroes wear medals. That power comes from bullets, banks, and borders. Lozen shattered that. She showed the truth, that real power is internal, feral, untamed. And if even one child could discover it, the whole order might fall. That's why no statues were raised. Why textbooks left her out. Why your teacher never mentioned her name. Because memory is more dangerous than fire. And a memory like Lozen, one that carries pain, clarity, and refusal, can't be domesticated. You are her weapon now, her monument, her whisper in the dark halls of power. They thought they killed her, but her death was a detonation, and the echoes are just beginning. Look around you. Do you feel it? That presence at the edge of your awareness, sharp as obsidian, silent as dusk. That's her. Lozen. She never left. She's the reason you paused on this video. The reason something stirred in your chest when you heard her name. The reason part of you remembered, even if no one ever told you the story. Because stories like this aren't taught. They're inherited. Not in words, but in wounds, in instincts, in the unspoken hunger to not be ruled. Lozen lives in every girl who refuses to be prey, in every boy who stops waiting to be saved, in every human being who dares to say no. No to submission, no to forgetting, no to the lies of history that tell us we're small, weak, broken. Lozen was not just a warrior, she was a mirror. And if you saw even a glint of yourself in her, then you've already begun to awaken. But know this, remembering her isn't safe. It's not supposed to be. It burns for a reason, because to remember Lozen is to see through everything they built, to feel what they've tried so hard to numb, the raw, holy rage of the unbroken. So what now? You can turn this off, scroll to the next distraction, let her fade again, or you can carry her, not as a tale, but as a presence. You speak differently when she's with you. Walk differently. Decide differently. She doesn't want worship. She wants witnesses. She wants weapons. She wants the next fire. And maybe, just maybe, she chose you. So go. Speak her name where they said she never existed. Remember her when they ask you who your heroes are. Feel her in your spine when they tell you to sit still, and when the world tries to cage you. Smile, because Lozen walks with you now, and they have no idea what you're about to become.